Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 139 in the series. Welcome back to the yarn room. It's lovely to see all of you, especially after the new year, post-holidays for most people. I'm 1 week away from the semester. For those of you who don't know, I'm a professor, and so the spring semester is almost upon us. I have 1 more week of, I hope, a little bit of chillaxing, but we'll see how that goes. There's a little bit of prep that goes into, teaching a new class. It's not new, it's a science fiction class. I've taught it before, but it's a new semester, so there's always something. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, I should say this is usually a podcast about knitting garments and garment design and modification in particular, though today I do have a shawl for you, which will be kind of a fun departure for us. And for those of you who are coming back, welcome back to the yarn room. It's lovely to see all of you. I hope your holidays and New Year's and time with family and relaxation were good. We actually had a kind of wild couple of weeks. I know I've been away from all of this for a couple of weeks and really enjoyed the downtime. We had my son came to stay with us over the holidays, and he brought his friend Trent, and Trent brought his hedgehog, Lily. So we had 2 college kids and a hedgehog in the house for Christmas and New Year, and it was really fun. Lily, the hedgehog, is still actually here. She is in the room behind me. We are babysitting. We are hedgehog sitting for the next, I think, another week, maybe week and a half, while Trent's away. So yeah, Lily's adorable. She is an albino hedgehog, so she can't apparently see light very well. She can distinguish light and dark, but she can't see very well. She's all white and really cute. You can kind of pick her up and hold her, and she lives in she likes her little blankets, and she eats cat food, and I don't really know much about her, but we've been taking good care of her. Trent, if you're watching, we're taking good care of Lily. So that was our break, along with just kind of relaxing a little bit, and I worked on a shawl, I'm working on a new sweater. Yeah, lots of fun stuff. So usually I tell you where you can find me and all that kind of good stuff at the beginning, so I'll just get that out of the way. I'm Knitting the Stash everywhere. So that's here on YouTube, over on Instagram, the blog. Where else do you find me? I don't even know. Ravelry. And then I have a website, knittingthestash.com, and that is where all of the yarn shop is. That's the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, where I feature indie farm yarns from around the country, around the US, including my own shorn yarn, and classes are over there, online classes, lots of good stuff. So knittingthestash.com if you want to follow up and check out any of the things that I talk about. And today's cast is all about the techniques that you avoid when you're knitting, because I came across a few of them over the break, and I just want to kind of throw that out there and see how other people are dealing with this. There are just certain techniques that I'm not that interested in, and for various reasons. And you all know that I love to learn new things, and I will try just about anything. I will challenge myself. It's not really, those aren't usually the issues with these techniques. It's just kind of technique avoidance, or avoidance techniques. So that's what I'm calling this episode. And one of them came up with the shawl. So we'll talk about the Nupp in contrast color today. And we're also going to talk about, what have I got? I've got a sweater on the needles. I might mention that a little bit. And that's because we're going to do a mini knit along for yarns in the Flock Farm Yarn Shop. And so we're going to do it from January to April. So that's January, February, March, and April, 4 months. And basically, if you knit a garment out of any of the yarns in the shop, then you can be entered to win a fun prize. The grand prize is going to be a $50 gift certificate to the shop, but also have some yarn prizes in there as well. We'll have a Ravelry thread. You can post your finished object photos over there to be entered into the knit along. And I know there are a bunch of you who are knitting garments with shorn for in particular. So if that's something you want to get in on, I have plenty of shorn for in the shop. This is the yarn that I just produced this past year. It's a beautiful gray, natural gray, 3-ply, DK weight yarn. And I do have sweater quantities left in the shop, so if you want to get in on the knit along, feel free to jump in and grab a sweater quantity. I know a lot of you have sweater quantities and you're knitting. I've been getting wonderful messages from some of you who are working on your sweaters already, sending pictures and things like that. And I just knit a sweater out of shorn, the Cuenca by Paula Pereira. So it's a beautiful yarn for sweaters, and I'm really excited to see what you all come up with. The sweater that I'm currently working on, that I'll just talk about for a quick second here, is the Soe. And this one is from the most recent Laine magazine. And it has these cable panels that run all the way from the neck down the arms. So this is the upper body of the sweater coming along the yoke. And I've been working on it with the another yarn from the shop. This is the Five Sisters Farm yarn. It's 100% Shetland, and it is a beautiful 2-ply Shetland yarn. That we have this natural kind of cream oatmeal color, and then a darker color. So if you were going to do color work, that might be perfect. We have some yarn from Ranching Tradition Fiber that I have sweater quantities of. Some yarn from Cactus Hill Farm that I have sweater quantities of. So if you want to get in on this knit along from January to April and knit a garment out of Flock Farm Yarn Shop, head on over to Ravelry, check out that knit along thread and post FO pictures. You can post progress pictures too. I'd love to see, you know, as things are coming along, but especially those FOs, finished garments, those will be entered to win those prizes that I talked about. So fun stuff. I'm pretty excited because knitting these sweaters from the yarns that I've kind of talked to the farmers and sometimes met the sheep around the country, it's just really, it's fun. It's like my little heartbeat of what I like to do around here. So that's pretty exciting for me. Okay, the last note before we jump into the shawl is that I still have my personal Destash going on over on knittingthestash.com. On the top bar, if you go to the more, there's a little thing that says more on the top bar. Hover over that and the Destash will pop up. And over there I'm destashing a lot of yarn. So if you're interested in getting something from my own personal collection, not from the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, that's where I'm destashing stuff. Half of it is already gone. There's still half of it up there, and I'm planning on adding more to it in the next week or so. So you can check back. And thanks to everyone who's been jumping on the Destash and buying things over there. That's just fun. I love seeing this yarn go to good new homes. It's going to be used. This is yarn that I love, and I loved it when I got it, but you know, I'm not using all of it, so it's time for it to go on to someone else. I've actually seen people have been tagging me on Instagram and some of the projects that they're working on with the Destash yarn, and it's just wonderful to see. It's like the yarn's being used, and that makes me happy. So anyway, okay, enough about hedgehogs and Destash and cows and all that stuff. Let's jump into the actual knitting and talk about techniques that we want to avoid. Avoidance techniques. So let me start with the positive. This is a beautiful shawl. This is the, well, it's kind of a mashup. You may have seen the Sabr, S-A-B-R, or the Shukr, S-H-U-K-R, both of them by Nidhi Kansal, and I talked about this shawl, I think on the last episode. I had just started it. And a bunch of you asked to see it when it was finished because the photos on Ravelry don't always show you what, there's a lot of focus on the border, which is a beautiful, this is a modified version of the border, but a lot of the photographs focus on the border and then don't always focus on all of the short rows that you do en route to the border. So this is a mashup of the Sabr and the Shukr. And I'll tell you why for a few different reasons, but I just want to let you admire it for a minute. It has these beautiful short rows that are done in mohair here. You can see all these different little blips running through the shawl. Those are all in mohair, inset short rows. See if the camera will pick up on them. Yeah, so these, the white here, and then the gold over here. This is all short rows. And then you have, it is a crescent-shaped shawl, so you start with your garter tab up here, and it has this spine down the center, which I think the camera kind of picks up on. Yeah, over here, there's a spine down the center here, which you can see with the yarn overs. Yeah, there you go. And you're just, you know, continually making it bigger so that you can see as a crescent-shaped shawl, if you set it over your shoulders, it kind of naturally hangs over your shoulders. And it is in, this is knit in the original colorways that she posted. So this is the Fruitful Fusion, I think it was like a Sunflower Ocean set. And that is the fingering weight yarn that you see here, the dark blue, the kind of lighter blue, the still lighter blue here, down there, and the gold at the bottom on the hem. Those are all from the Fruitful Fusions gradient set. And then I subbed in the mohair because the mohair that she used, I couldn't get a hold of all the colors. So I just subbed in the, I think it's Webb's Valley Yarns Southampton. It's their mohair, basically, like in-house mohair. And I just chose colors that were very similar to the original pattern, it was a little easier for me to get a hold of that yarn, so that's the way I went, and I think they're pretty close, pretty darn close to the original. I didn't use at least one of the colors from the Fruitful Fusion set. I'm trying to, let me pull in my bag here. So this is the color I didn't use. It's more of a yellow, and I actually put a few rows in with this yellow, and it was like the wrong, because I was doing a shortened version of the Sabr, or a different version of the Shukr, this color just didn't fit in with the master plan very well, so I ended up pulling out, oh my gosh, I think it might have been like 6 rows, and those 6 rows were around a bunch of mohair short rows, so it was not a pretty thing. I have a pile of mohair that's just sitting on my table downstairs. So I just like the way that this progression works from the dark to the lighter blues, and then the mohair goes from the gold to the white, to this color, which you may or may not be able to see. There's a kind of lighter mohair color right here that's very similar to this color, but it's a mohair color, and then the border is mohair in here, and it is a color that's very similar to kind of playing off of this color. So there's a nice riffing going on with this color palette. Some of the things that I did change, you'll notice I put a bunch of notes over on my Ravelry page in case you wanted to do a mashup of these 2 shawls as well. I liked the Sabr. It's the bigger version of the shawl, and that's the one that she did use this color palette for. So that shawl is actually much longer, like wider wingspan and deeper. So for example, it begins with, I think there are 5 of these short row things in the original, like 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that deep before you ever switch to the next color. And for me, I'm not a big, huge shawl wearer. When I wear shawls, I want to wear them like tucked up under my coat or over a sweater for work or something like that. So I wanted a shawl that was going to be about this long so that when I tucked it up, it wasn't just like massive amounts of fabric, just everywhere. So what I did is, the first modification I made is to shorten each of the sections. The color changes, I suppose. So I kept the same short row patterning that's in the original in terms of stitch count and where they were placed, but I switched colors faster. So after just 2 of these repeats, I switched colors to the next set of colors, and then I switched colors again to the next set of colors, and then I switched colors again. So I just kind of more rapidly switched my colors, basically, because the Sabr version, the larger version, it allows you to use all the different colors in that set, and the Shukr version, which is the shorter version, doesn't give you as much latitude in terms of the number of colors you can use. So by doing that mashup, I was able to keep most of the original colors but make the shorter shawl, if that makes sense. Now, there were some other tricky things about this, because the pattern itself, if you just did this, let's just pretend you did this whole thing in just a single fingering weight yarn and a single color of mohair. And there are versions of that up on the project pages on Ravelry. If you did that, you would find that both the Sabr and the Shukr are identical through maybe the first third of the pattern. It's completely identical. Then the Shukr, the smaller version, does some different things, and because of the color choices she made with that one, it has some different configurations of the short rows. You start doing some different things to make the bottom of the shawl look slightly different. So at that point, I also had to make some decisions about kind of keeping some of the original short row versions and shortening off that last set of short rows that's where I pulled out this extra yellow. I had used that and I just didn't like the way it looked, because in the Shukr version, the shorter version, there are many more garter stitch rows toward the bottom, and the garter stitch was all in this yellow color, which was the wrong color for the palette. I ended up, not the palette, but the number of short row repeats and the colors that ended up in here. So I cut that part out. That's the part that I pulled out, and then I just went with the border from the original, if that makes sense. but I'd use the stitch counts from the shorter version. It gets a little confusing. Just understand, this is a mashup. This is not exactly what you would get if you worked the Sabr or the Shukr. This is my own kind of play around with it. And the biggest change is, unfortunately, to the border, which was the reason that I wanted to knit this shawl in the first place, is this beautiful mohair border that has these contrasting colored nupps, and it has this gold kind of coloring on both the top and the bottom. I didn't do all the nupps, so let's talk about that for a second. It was one of those things where I picked up the pattern, loved the colors, you know, got the yarn, started working on it, made my modifications, thinking to myself, can't wait until I get to the border, can't wait until I get to the border, yay, it's gonna be the best. And I got to the border and I realized, silly me, I didn't bother reading through the whole pattern. I just was like idealistically very happy, like this border's gonna be gorgeous. And it is. But it calls for contrasting colored nupps in the mohair. Now, I'm not against nupps, I'm not against popcorn, I'm not against baubles. If they're used in the right places in the right ways, you know, we don't have to be anti-bauble or anti-popcorn or anti-nupp around here. Everything has its place. And the nupp, as I think many of you know, when I was working on some Estonian knitting techniques and Estonian knitting history a bunch of episodes back, the nupp came up quite a bit because it is one of the techniques that gets used a lot in Estonian knitting. So nupps look a lot like baubles or popcorn. They're just created in a slightly different way, and they have a little bit more of a, depending on how many strands of yarn you're using, they have a little bit more of a, like a, I don't know what you want to call it, like a seashell kind of look to them at the end. So you actually see the individual strands of yarn kind of sitting on top of the fabric like this. Whereas like a bauble or even a popcorn might look a little bit more mashed up, depending on how you do them or execute them. So I like the way nupps look. I think they're beautiful, especially in single colored fabric, which is a lot of the Estonian knitting does that. You know, you just incorporate the nupps as part of your texture in your knitting. But when you get to working a nupp in contrast color on mohair, it gets to be a little bit much. I got to a point where I was like, I can't be bothered with this. And I tried it a number of different times in a number of different ways. And there are videos in the pattern, like links to videos on YouTube of how you could execute the nupps. And there are lines of nupps in the original. You know, it's like, it's not just one nupp, it's like 4 in a kind of diagonal row. So there are video tutorial links to how to do that. It involves basically knitting a nupp, guesstimating how much yarn you need for the nupp, and then thinking about, well, I need 5 more of those, so I'm going to need this much yarn, and you kind of, it's almost like intarsia, like you'd keep a bobbin sitting here, you know, under this row of nupps, diagonal row of nupps, and you would use that same yarn every time you came back across to execute a nupp. I think that's awesome. I think that's brilliant. I think it looks really, really cool when it's executed. But at this point, I just could not be bothered. I tried the nupps several different ways. I wasn't exactly sure how they were going to come out because in this pattern you had to, the border's knit last. And as you can see, the border is long. I mean, it is a long shawl at this point, even though this is the shorter version of the shawl. And it was unclear to me if I was going to be good enough at the nupps to execute them all the way across, because you have to do them on one row and then you have to purl them on the way back. Purl like 7 stitches together on the way back. And I could have swatched, and I did swatch on the actual shawl, but I mean, I could have swatched and practiced and done, you know, all the things that you would do to get good at the nupps so that you would know what they would look like on your shawl border going across. I just couldn't be bothered. It was like the holiday season. I was trying to do a chill knit. I was trying not to like stress myself out too much, and that just seemed like a lot. So I ended up going with a slightly different plan for the border. You can see I do have some of the contrasting little bobbly things in the border. There aren't that many of them, but you get the idea. It gestures toward the original. And I ended up doing a popcorn technique instead of the nupp technique, because with the popcorn technique I could actually execute the whole thing all at once. So I could make the popcorn and then I could purl the popcorn together and see what it was going to look like without having to knit an entire row in mohair and then come back across hoping that the nupps would work out. So I popcorned. I got the technique from, let's see, it was Susie Sparkle's knitting blog, I think, and she talked all about nupps in the main color, like regular, you know, using nupps for texture, and then she was like, you can also just do them as popcorns. They don't look exactly the same, don't get me wrong here, but because you can execute them all within one move, you can at least see what they're going to look like and then be happy with them before you move on to the rest of your border. I ended up doing them each individually, so I had ends to weave in for each of these little tiny baubles that you see. And because this is a superwash yarn that I was working with, those ends aren't as sticky as using like 100% wool yarn, so I had to weave them in. I don't know if they're gonna stay 100%. They stayed through the washing process. They look pretty good right now, but you know, it's one of those things with superwash yarn, because it's not grabby. You know, it doesn't have that kind of felting potential of wool, non-superwash wool. I don't know how those ends are gonna hold up over time, but I'm just hoping that they're okay. But yeah, I think I had like 52 ends to weave in, which was a lot. But I was happy that I have at least some gesture toward the bauble of the original. And then because I wasn't working the rest of the baubles, I wanted to make sure that I had, you know, proportionality to the whole thing. So I basically continued to work just about as many rows below the little popcorny bobbly nup thing as I had above it, so that before I worked this border in and the cast off in this alternating color. So that's my story of the nup. Not super successful. It's not that I wouldn't go back to it, and it's not a technique that I would be like, I want to learn this someday, right? Like, so we should get into this technique avoidance thing. I have a few techniques that I try to avoid when I'm knitting, and I'm guessing you do too, and I'd love to know what they are. So I'm going to open up a Ravelry thread. I'd love to hear them in the comments below here, what techniques you avoid and why, because I think there are a bunch of different reasons that, I know there are a bunch of reasons I avoid certain techniques, so can't be bothered, number one. I just can't be bothered. I want to knit something that's chill. I don't want to bother with the nup in the contrast color on mohair. You know, call me crazy, but I was done at that point. So you can't be bothered. Maybe it's something that you just don't want to take the time to learn right now. Like for me, that would be something like intarsia, which I've watched a lot of videos about. I know you can use the bobbins. I love some of the projects that people create with intarsia, and that's where you have, you know, basically like a stockinette or a plain background, and you have like, you know, an image just kind of sitting in the middle, you know, and you're using the bobbins to kind of create the color work and then stop the color work and then, you know, go on with your main color. I think someday I might try intarsia and really like it, but right now it's one of those techniques that, like, I don't have the time to learn it right now. I'm not really invested in it. I love looking at it, but I don't want to do it. So that's number two. I think number three might be that you can't actually do it. So I have a few techniques like that. If a pattern calls for me to crochet something, like a crocheted edge or, you know, a crocheted cast on or something like that, not going to do it. I can't. I actually can't do it. Maybe it's something with many years of time and manual dexterity I could try. I'm good with knitting needles, but that crochet hook, the minute you put it in my hand, I cannot manage anything. And it's not one of those things where I've had my knitting and spinning ladies, you know, they're often trying to encourage me. They'll give me a mini lesson on crochet. They'll show me how to do it. They'll sit with me while I try. So it's not that I don't have good teachers or that I haven't had opportunities, or it's not there for me. It's one of those things. And maybe there are knitting techniques for you that are like that, where, you know, you go to try to execute something and you actually just manually, you can't do it. So those are some of the techniques you might avoid. You're like, oh, that sweater calls for, you know, 3 color work. I just can't do that, you know, with my hands won't do it, or whatever it is. So I think those are 3 reasons. And they seem legitimate to me in terms of not wanting to knit something. You know, you can't be bothered, you don't want to take the time to learn right now, or you really actually just can't physically do it. But I'd like to know if there are other things that you avoid, because I think as I said, I like to learn things. I like to be challenged. There are things that I have learned over the years that I appreciate as a technique that I also don't really go for. Like, I understand how to do brioche. I don't often pick it up as like a go-to kind of a thing, but if there were a garment or an accessory that had brioche that I really loved and I needed to use brioche, I would do it. You know, like I can execute it. I can do it, right? Like I physically can do it. I've learned it, so I understand it. And if it's a project that I really love, I could be bothered, right? Same with entrelac. Like I can do entrelac, you know, physically, and you know, I actually understand how it works. Sometimes I can't be bothered with it. And then things like 3-color color work. I've learned to really like that. I've learned to really like color work. I've learned to like 3-color color work. I think I probably can handle 4-color color work. But that's also a technique that a lot of people might avoid. And I was also thinking of short rows. Some people will avoid short rows like the plague because they either don't understand them, they can't be bothered with them, they haven't learned them, or, you know, physically doing it might be really tricky. With short rows, I would have to say, find a short row technique that you like, because when I first started doing short rows, I think I had learned the wrap and turn method, and I just could not spatially and visually see that little wrap enough to be able to pick it up on the next time around. Once I learned German short rows, that was it. I was short rowing everything. I was like, I get this. This makes sense to me. I know how to execute it anywhere on anything, and it doesn't produce holes. It's great. So if you're, sometimes there are techniques where you can actually learn a variation of it, and that will be the thing that you love. It'll be the technique that, you know, becomes your go-to technique. So all of this is to say, there is technique avoidance. There are avoidance techniques out there for those of us who knit, and sometimes they're justified, and sometimes, you know, we might actually want to learn them, or if we have the space or the time to learn them, or if we're given an option to learn them or execute that technique in a different way, it might actually be to our benefit. For example, the nupps, I couldn't be bothered and I couldn't really get them to work very well. But once I did the popcorns, that was pretty good. And I actually did consider just doing popcorn over and over and over again without, you know, just producing a lot of ends and then weaving them in. But in the end, I decided not to. Yeah, so I'd be really curious to know what avoidance techniques you use in your knitting. Are there things that you're just like, no, I'm never going to do that? Or are there things that you felt that way about initially and then you learned to do them and absolutely love them and have like incorporated them into your repertoire? So let's do comments below, and let's do a giveaway for the comments. This will be fun. I will pull some fun yarn out of my own personal stash to send you. I don't know what it'll be yet. It'll be a little surprise, but if you leave a comment below, we'll do a giveaway. Let me know which techniques you're avoiding or which techniques you used to avoid that you don't avoid anymore, and you'll be entered in the giveaway, and I'll pull a random answer in a couple of weeks and send the prize out. So yeah, that'll be fun. All right, that is probably enough random talk about nupps and shawls and whatnot for the day. Keep in mind that we've got the cowl for the Flock Farm Yarn garments going from January to April, so head over to Ravelry if you want to get in on that. Start knitting. Once you leave that FO, you'll be entered into that giveaway, and I'm so excited to see what you all produce and come up with for the yarns in the shop. So Shorn and Five Sisters Farm Yarn and Cactus Hill and Wrenching Tradition. There are so many yarns over there that are perfect for sweaters, so I'll be excited to see what you come up with. And in the meantime, I hope you have fun knitting and avoid whatever you want to avoid and do whatever you want to do, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.